Perfect.
Okay, it's recording. Great. Okay, take it away, Pierce.
All right, cool. Hi, everyone. I really want to thank the Historic Preservation for inviting me to speak at the series. I'm a graduate student at the University of Oklahoma, and I'm in the second year of my PhD program. I'm also in Ms. Lily's 10 a.m. Choctaw Notebook class, where my name appears as Kevin W. So some of us might have been having virtual interactions for the past month or so. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm a white archaeologist, and there's a long history of people who share this positionality, not acknowledging the authority of Native communities to tell their own history. If archaeologists are serious about decolonizing academia, we need to be comfortable with letting the communities we work with direct and guide the research. This is the approach that I try to take in my work. I really want to thank the Historic Preservation Department for inviting me to speak at this series. I have really enjoyed working with the research group over the summer and calling Jennifer and Megan my bosses. In this talk, I will provide you all with a brief introduction as to who I am. I'll then introduce you to the Choctaw sites and talk about the project that we did. And at the end, I'll hand the proverbial mic over to Kristen and Deanna, and they will tell you about the Homestead project. A little bit about me. I've been a nerd my entire life. I grew up around Washington, D.C., where history played a big role in my upbringing. In high school, I was in a historical reenactment club. I guess you can say I was a cool kid. And now I'm an archaeologist. When I went off to college, I was looking for a major that could combine the things that I enjoyed. History, religion, language, science. And that's what led me to take my first archaeology course. And when I graduated, I actually started working as an archaeologist in several different capacities. But the more I did it, I found myself becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the work that I was doing. I wasn't happy. So shortly after that, I actually quit being an archaeologist altogether and started working at a coffee shop. I remember I still had dreams of opening up my own store at some point. And it wasn't until about a year and a half later that I found myself actually volunteering on an excavation with the same professor who taught my first archaeology class all those years ago. And it was during that brief employment that I had an experience that I think really put my career in the direction that it's on now. One day after field work, we all piled into the same car, and we were making our way into the country where we were scheduled to give a talk to a small local chapter of an archaeological society. And what proceeded next was just this absolute comedy of errors. The first thing that happened was that we blew out a tire. And if that wasn't bad enough, we soon found ourselves caught in this torrential downpour. So if the universe was telling us anything at that point, it might be that we should not attend this talk. So we called the organizer and said, look, we're sorry, we can't make it. But she wouldn't let us cancel. She insisted my professor give the talk and told us to hang tight. So she came, picked us up, and we arrived at the venue over an hour and a half after the talk was supposed to start. And this whole time I was wondering, why is this organizer insisting that we come? Is it really a big deal if we have to cancel an event where at most there was going to be maybe 10 people? It was very wrong. When we arrived, we couldn't even enter the room where the talk was being held because it was just so packed. There must have been 150 people from all over the county, packed in this unair-conditioned house who wanted to hear this talk. And as far as I knew, these people were not indigenous to the land. And in all likelihood, most of them probably were not even from the state. But after the talk, they continued to stick around and visit, tell stories, chat with us, all wanting to learn more about the past connections that people shared with this land. I had learned how history can be used to affect policy. This was the first time I remember seeing how stories of the past having a different emotional effect on people. And it was powerful. And I kind of wanted to be a part of it. With that experience in mind, I decided to go back to school to get my graduate degree and wanted my archaeology to have this community-based focus. As I alluded to earlier, one of the biggest sins of archaeology is that it's not acknowledged tribal histories. Historically, archaeologists have over-relied on historical documents written from the perspective of European men. We've also used a classification system that tends to treat cultures as static and unchanging. And lastly, there is a general lack of understanding about how severe the effects of colonization were. Diseases, raids for enslaved persons, and wars were all things caused by Europeans that contributed to indigenous communities moving from their ancestral homelands and reorganizing themselves. And archaeology itself has been a colonial agent. During the early 20th century, the false myth that state landscapes. And this just hasn't resulted in misguided research, but it's caused incredible political and emotional harm for many Native communities. When I heard about this project involving Choctaw archaeology, I was encouraged to reach out to Dr. Ian Thompson. I did, and he, along with members of the preservation department, helped design the research for this project. The motivation for wanting to engage with the tribe was influenced by several thoughts. Aside from Ian and the preservation department's expertise on Choctaw archaeology, I was drawing from my own previous experience in witnessing how stories of history can affect communities on a political and emotional level. If I was going to be working on a site that was sacred and had a deep ancestral connection to the Choctaw community, the Choctaw must be given the opportunity to guide and direct this research. And in doing so, challenge some of these outdated and historically racist approaches that archaeologists have used to tell Native history. The project that I heard about was focused on a series of Choctaw sites in Mississippi. In the 2010s, a survey company called Tennessee Valley Archaeological Research, or TVAR, uncovered 3 archaeological sites in Kemper County. And based on the objects recovered, TVAR believed these sites were actually the remnants of Choctaw homesteads that dated to the 18th century. Specifically, these sites were likely connected to the village of Shomo-Takale. And this was a critical time period in Choctaw history. Not only were the French occupying areas around the Mobile Bay and the Mississippi Delta, but communities like the Tahomes, Naniaba, and Mobila were gradually becoming incorporated into the larger Choctaw Confederacy. And TVAR wanted to learn more about the history of the Choctaw ancestors who lived at these sites. And what came out of them is some very interesting material culture. And so for the next few minutes, I just want to show you some images from the sites. Most of these images are coming from the site report that was published by TVAR in 2017. The first thing I want to talk to you about is just the architecture. And what you're seeing here is a map drawing of the structural foundations recovered from the sites. Shomo-Takale dates to a time period when the Mobile Bay was occupied by the French. As a historical reference, I think of this time as being kind of around the Revolutionary War. And one of the sites displays a very unique blend of French and Choctaw architecture. The structural remains found at one of the sites is very reminiscent of a French colonial style, pied-à-terre, and it would have kind of looked like a log cabin. But there's also evidence of an open-sided structure. This is it's a very unique style practiced by many indigenous communities throughout the Southeast during this time. And we don't know exactly what this means. Some researchers have suggested that there were French colonists living with the Choctaws at the site. We know that there was a French practice of sending young boys to live with local communities in order to learn the language to help negotiate trade. But some researchers would probably want to remind us that just because something looks European in style doesn't mean it wasn't Choctaw. Ancestral Choctaws could have definitely incorporated this style after interacting with the French. And regardless, the architectural patterns here we see are incredibly interesting for learning more about Choctaw history. This is a famous painting done by Francois Bernard, and TVAR pointed out that it does a good job of conveying, even if in a romantic style, the hypothetical layout of this village. To the left, you can see this open-sided shelter with families underneath, and over to the right, you can see what appears to be a log cabin. Aside from the unique architecture, there's also some very interesting archaeological features. On the left, you see the remains of an earth oven that was lined with slabs of sandstone. And to the right, you see the remnants of what archaeologists think was actually a pottery kiln. And that was denoted by this layer of fired clay and bits of ceramic over top a layer of soot. The Shomotakali homesteads also display a very diverse set of material culture. Lots of projectile points were recovered, and these were made from all different kinds of stone. And Tivar also recovered points that were made from metals like copper and brass. The materials used to make these objects likely came from European trade, and because of that, I think these objects are really cool because they represent ancestral ingenuity and ability to incorporate new materials into everyday technology. Lots of metal hardware was found. Here are some percussion hammers that would have likely been attached to objects like a hunting rifle. You also have bits of flint as well. And you also have objects like axe blades that tell us more about Choctaw foodways. Dr. Thompson made the observation that these were agricultural tools, and when associated with the remnants of foodstuffs found at the sites like corn cobs and squash rinds, it suggests that Choctaw residents living at the Shomotakali sites were likely growing some of these crops. Personal items were also recovered, like this thimble and awl. And you also get some really unique objects. For anyone interested in textiles, this is a bit of hardened clay that contains an impression made of fabric. And out of all of the material culture recovered, Shomotakali displays an incredibly rich ceramic assemblage. I'm just going to show you some photos, but I'm not going to say anything about them. I would like you all just to simply observe, and I'll explain why in a minute. Pretty incredible craftsmanship by Choctaw ancestors. One thing I hope you all noticed was that these did not all look the same. Not only were they decorated in different ways, but some were also made with different materials. And for archaeologists, that's a very important observation to make. Even the smallest details about how something was made can tell us a whole lot about the people who made them. So, how do we use these objects to retell Choctaw history? Dr. Thompson has been doing some incredible work using archaeology to revitalize Choctaw traditions. The work that Ian and Amy are doing on the Nanawaya Homestead is a fantastic example of this revitalization. And Ian did this using a unique combination of his own indigenous perspective and what's called experimental archaeology. In this approach, the researcher learns how something was made or used by replicating or recreating these behaviors themselves. So if you wanted to learn more about how Choctaw ancestors made pottery and learn about the significance of those differences, you need to try and recreate them yourself. This is a gradual process, and it takes a long time to learn about the kinds of materials and techniques that go into making these objects. But at the end, you just don't learn about these past behaviors, but you get a sense of what connections individuals would have maintained with the land. In this project, we thought that recreating some of these objects from the Shomotakali sites would allow us to learn about the specific behaviors that speak to lived experiences of the Choctaw ancestors. The questions we were interested in asking included, where is the clay being collected from? What kinds of knowledge goes into making these ceramics? And how is that knowledge shared within the community? By answering these questions, we thought that we could learn more about the different aspects of life at the Choctaw sites, like trade, exchange, and social dynamics. First, if we wanted to recreate ancestral knowledge, we needed to gather materials, and the first step involved traveling to the homeland. In July of 2018, myself, Ian, and members of the TVAR staff went and collected clay from the areas surrounding the Choctaw sites. Our reasoning was that if we wanted to learn more about how ancestral Choctaws made pottery, we needed to use materials that they would have likely had access to. And so we ended up collecting clays from several different areas. These included stream beds, but then also outcrops on hills. And the recommendation for this came from Ian recalling a story about a young man who stopped at a hill to gather clay for his relatives. A lot of this clay we found had this pale gray, rich color to it, and it had almost like a fatty texture to it. The next step involved firing. It's hard to analyze clay when it's wet, so I set out to learn how ceramics might have been fired in a traditional Choctaw manner. And after talking with Ian, I had the opportunity to watch a ceramicist, Tammy Bean, fire her ceramics at Moundville, and I was super thankful that she was able to give me some pointers. The photos you see here are from a firing I got to watch that was done by her at Moundville. And I tried this myself. And I'll admit, it didn't go exactly as I planned. But that's okay. I was learning about the process through all of this. Even though they weren't super pretty like I hoped, and I had some difficulty maintaining the fire, they were ready to be analyzed. The next step came measurement. And when we made the transition from the field to the lab, we wanted to compare the ceramic objects recovered from the Choctaw sites to the ones that I had created. Although the human eye is a powerful tool, in some cases, the differences we're interested in are just the ones we cannot make visually. And one of the questions we wanted to ask is whether the vessels recovered from the Choctaw sites were in fact made there or from somewhere else. And to answer this question, we need to use tools that could allow us to examine the clay materials in the ceramic objects themselves. And for that, we had to get small, really small, all the way down to the chemical element. One of the main perks about being an archaeologist is that we get to play with some pretty cool toys. But one of the tools I got to use was called LAICPMS, which stands for Laser Ablated Inductively Coupled Plasma Mass Spectrometry. And what this object does is it shoots a laser at a sample, removes the tiniest bit of material, and turns it into gas. This gas is then charged via plasma, and then it's magnetically filtered in several stages. So at the end, the machine can tell you how much of an element, like iron, copper, or nickel, is found in the ceramic. Another tool I used is called XRF, or X-ray fluorescence, and rather than using plasma and magnets, it uses X-rays to tell us what elements are inside the sample. But I wasn't just concerned with the elements. We also wanted to look at the actual materials inside the ceramic. For this, I conducted what's called petrographic analysis. Here, we took very small bits of the object, placed them under a microscope, and recorded and measured what we found inside the clay by looking at cross sections, like the ones you see here. And we found many different kinds of materials. And these included sand, and you can tell this by these like angular white square things. We also found bits of shell, which you can tell by these thin white plates. And also bits of grog, or crushed pottery. After all the data was collected, we started to see some patterns. What you're seeing here is a typical graph that archaeologists and statisticians use. It's kind of confusing. I've been looking at it now for 2 years and it still confuses me, but I'm going to do my best to walk you through it. One variable that we focused on was lutetium. It's a rare earth element that exists in very small amounts in clay. And we noticed two observations. One of the Shomotakali sites, this 22Ke718, had ceramics with two very different chemical signatures. One group that you can see in green had ceramics with a high count of lutetium, and one with, a low count. And this was interesting because when we compared it to the other site, it had a more kind of uniform distribution of this element within the ceramics. So what explains this gap then? While looking for answers, we collected on ceramics from Moundville, an ancient Mississippian site in Alabama. We brought in this data because we know that Western Alabama is one of the areas with ancestral connections to the Choctaw. And one of the observations that we made is that some of the older ceramic types found from the Shomotakali sites, these two dots right here, the Alabama River and Grace Brush ceramics, had a chemical signature, according to lutetium, that actually looked very similar to ones we're finding in Western Alabama. So what does it all mean? Why is it important? I presented and discussed some of these observations with some of you back in 2018, and I'd like to go back to those interpretations. One interpretation is that these differences were the results of pottery function. Indigenous and experimental archaeology done by Dr. Thompson reveals that the materials selected in making pottery are often reflective of the function it was designed for. Large cooking vessels would have been made using clay materials that could experience repeated instances of heating and cooling, while serving wares were likely made with clays that were more malleable and durable for serving. Another idea that was presented from the community is that the differences we observe are the influence of the Choctaw clan groups. During the 18th century, we know that there were two major groups of clans in Choctaw society that influenced several aspects of village life. The traditional Choctaw custom was that individuals needed to marry someone from the other clan group. So to an extent, it's possible that two different kinds of ceramics made at one of the villages of Shomotakali is reflective of these social dynamics. If members of the different clan groups were living in separate parts of the village, we might expect there to be differences in how the pottery was made, and it can maybe explain that gap. And a third idea that was presented is that the ceramics we see here were made in different styles because they come from areas outside of Shomotakali. During the mid-18th century, we know that the Choctaw hunters were heavily involved in fur trades with the French. And while traveling, many of them came to stay at homesteads like the Shomotakali sites. It's possible that during these hunting trips, these hunters brought with them their own serving wares from their own respective villages. And these could all be true. The Choctaw homeland and surrounding areas were a dynamic landscape with diverse populations. And during the times when Shomotakali was occupied, communities like the Tahome, Naneaba, and Mobila were gradually being incorporated into this larger Choctaw Confederacy. Regardless of which specific interpretations we think influence the differences in how the Choctaw ceramics were made, I think they represent this dynamic landscape. Foodways, clan groups, and lifestyles, all the things we suggest that contribute to the differences we see in ceramics are influenced by these unique indigenous connections with the land. And the last point I want to make is this. Archaeology is a form of storytelling, where instead of using words, we rely on objects. But like any story, meaning and tone depend on the storyteller's perspective. And through collaboration and ongoing engagement, archaeology can be used to tell stories of Choctaw history that speak more readily about a dynamic relationship with a truly diverse landscape. That's it. Thank you all.
Thank you, Pierce. That was a great presentation. We have one question in the chat from Angela. She says, or she asks, do the ceramics have any resemblance to ceramics found in other parts of the Americas, such as Mexico or parts of Central America?
There are definite resemblances. I don't know about those areas specifically, but we do know there's the definite resemblance to other areas throughout the Southeast. One thing that I need to always remind myself as an archaeologist that styles change over time. And so it can be interesting to try and make those connections. But specifically within the areas surrounding the Choctaw homeland, places in Western Alabama, Louisiana, parts of Arkansas, there's lots of similarities there.
It's an excellent point. Do we have any more questions from the viewers for Pierce?
I have somebody texting me. They couldn't quite do it in the chat. So they are, so this is from Krista. She's asking, are we talking about Six-Town people in that community in the farther south?
Sorry, what was the question?
Do you know if Okla Hanali, was that the individuals that were living, the Six Towns people that were living in that community or down south? Is that in that region? Is that who you're talking about?
I'm not sure, no.
Okay, okay. She's typing.
Based upon like my looking at where the different districts were, I got the impression that this might have been the group, the Ahapat. But again, I'm not the expert on that. I'm not entirely sure.
Okay. Yeah, she's still typing, but I was doing some analysis on that lower region and looking at how those influences came in and kind of trying to pinpoint some of those areas as you talked about with the Tahoma and the incorporation of smaller communities into the larger Choctaw population at the time. And, you know, really that regionality is happening from island and peninsula and bayou and stuff. So that's a really great opportunity that you were able to research. So she wants me to give you this comment. She says, I really appreciate your dedication to working with Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and to help dictate where your research is going. She says, Chukma, thank you very much for that. So.
Thank you very much for that comment. It's a really big honor to have been able to collaborate with the Historic Preservation on this and also be invited to speak at the series. I relayed by sign myself to get the invitation, so thank you.
Okay, we have another question from Roger. He asks, what were the names of the two clans you referred to? If you don't mind saying those again.
Sure. Well, if Ms. Lilly is in this presentation, she might give the correct me, but I can go back to my slide here. Find it. The two clan groups of the moieties were Imoklasha and then Okla Iholada.
Okay. We have another question from Chris. He asks, how long did you fire your pottery for your tests?
I don't think long enough. I was doing this. Tammy Bean told me the whole process takes about 5 hours. That kind of also depends on, you know, whether the ground is dry or wet, the actual size of the vessels and how thick the vessel things are. What am I trying to say? Walls, yeah. And when I did this, I tried to replicate just that. I did mine for about 5 hours. I don't think it got quite hot as it needed to be. And my guesstimation for that is the fact that my creations still retains some of that kind of darker texture to it. I think that's the organic bits that haven't been fully fired through. But if you're looking for like a correct guess or idea of how long vessels need to be fired for, I really encourage you to reach out to Dr. Ian Thompson, who's the pottery specialist on this. Most of everything, my knowledge, came from him and Tammy being on this.
All right, it looks like Angela has a follow-up question. She's asking if there was evidence that you were able to find of enclosed ovens that could have been used for firing pottery rather than just the open fire pottery that we do today, or that method we do today.
I'm not sure. I was not an individual who actually worked at the excavation of the site. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't quite answer that question. But it would be curious to know that.
Okay, so we have a question from Jamie Rogers. What's the youngest age of ceramics you found? Any after the 18th century?
Hard question to ask. Based on the seriation that TVAR produced, they gave the date of occupation or thereabouts of these Shomotakali sites to the very end of the 18th century, possibly into the 19th century. And the ceramic type that went along with that was this Kemper combed type. I don't know if I think I might have a picture of there, but yeah, some of the Kemper combed artifacts, objects were ones that I think definitely leaded over to after the 18th century it ended.
Okay, we have another question from Roger. Roger asks, can you interpret the designs featured in the pottery you depicted?
Can I interpret them?
Yeah.
I am not the person to interpret designs. I know archaeologists have done, like we do typological analysis, like we'll say this style is reminiscent of what we see over here. And so we can try and make correlations about that, but we understand too that designs change over time. And this idea about understanding the meaning behind symbols, that's something out of my realm of expertise. Especially since I'm not Indigenous.
Okay, I'm trying to take Ian off of mute, but I can't see him on the attendee list. He said he can try to help out with some questions.
Yeah, pretty good.
One of the other questions that just came in addition to pottery, this is a question about the metallic objects that you found. Was there evidence that they were from trading, or was there any evidence of the community having mined ore to make these metal objects?
The question was whether they were trading or they were being made there?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I don't know. When I learned and read about these metal points that are made from sheets of brass and copper, I always got the impression that the items that were being traded were first brought into the communities, and then they came from objects like brass kettles or other objects, and then they were incorporated there. So I don't know if they were being made separately and then brought in, or they were being made actually there within the context of those sites.
That's what that's what I had learned too. Was that it was more of they would trade for things that the metal pots, and then they would kind of repurpose them and cut them down for what they needed. So I would learn that too. Were you able to unmute Ian, Kristen?
No, not yet. Just give me a few seconds.
I guess, this is just a kind of a personal curiosity, Pierce. What was attractive to you about experimental archaeology? I know that that's something going through grad school was kind of a hot topic, right? It's kind of borderline between being able to venture out and look outside the box to be able to practice and put into practice some of these things that we're seeing, some of these things we're analyzing. So what was attractive to you about taking that approach?
Well, definitely just, I think for me, well, one of them, I'll just be honest, was doing something different from the old style archaeology of working in the lab, looking at these things underneath the light, and actually going out and visiting these places, actually experiencing what it's like to make these things. My big thing is community. And so any chance that I can get to kind of go out and have those interactions was definitely something for one. So it was definitely partially influenced by personal, like I want to get out and interact with people. But then also too, I'm more interested in these questions about, connections with the land. And that when you're looking in a lab under a microscope and trying to quantify the different amounts of temper versus designs, it's a little hard to get at that sometimes. And I think this gets a much better interaction with that. I wasn't very good, but.
Sorry, we have kind of an unconventional way of getting Ian on here. I think there's some connection issues, but Ian, I'm unmuted. So if you want to offer some suggestions or some answers, go ahead.
Sure. So let me start by thanking Pierce. I really enjoyed your presentation. You did an awesome job. I've enjoyed working with you on this project, seeing what you're doing. But I think I can help you out with a couple of the questions. One of the questions was about pottery firing time. With traditional ceramics, it's not so much about how long they fire as about the maximum temperature that's reached. So you could reach a firing temperature in just a few minutes, and it would functionally fire the pottery. But the issue is traditional ceramics have to be treated with care. They have to be heated and cooled slowly or they'll break. So we may spend 5 hours firing it. It's not that the pottery has to be hot for 5 hours. It could be hot for 10 minutes. It'll be functionally fired. We just do the rest, heat it up slowly, cool it down slowly so that it doesn't crack. And then I believe there was a question about enclosed kilns. Nothing like that was found at the site. I've heard of one possible incident that's in the southeast of an enclosed kiln. It was buried into the ground. There may be others. Our traditional accounts of Choctaw pottery firing from the 1800s do talk about firing it on top of the ground. A lot of the ceramics from Choctaw sites that Pierce has been showing you have inclusions of shell temper in them. With those, you have to hit a very narrow temperature window when you're firing. It's got to be between about 1,000 degrees and 1,250 degrees Fahrenheit. So the easiest way to do that is to look at the pot while you're firing, especially if you're firing it at night, and it will glow different colors that tell you very accurately what the temperature is. So that's certainly not to say that shell temper couldn't be fired in an enclosed kiln traditionally, but generally it's a lot easier to be able to look at the pots. And then there was also a question about digging ore at Shomotakali. So a lot of folks don't realize it, but metal was used before European contact in the Choctaw homeland, going back at least a couple thousand years. So what they used was copper that was imported from elsewhere. They also used at least a little bit of silver that was imported from elsewhere. A lot of the metallic objects that you've been seeing, Pierce show you, are trade items, and those were all brought in post-1700. We didn't have metal trade items before about 1700 or so. There were questions about how late the pottery went in Shomotakali. It went right in the Trial of Tears time period, is my understanding. And of course, it continued to be produced in Oklahoma. I know of one elder here who watched her grandmother making that pottery in Oklahoma. So it's a tradition that almost fell asleep, but not quite. There's still a living memory going back for pottery production here, unbroken to the homeland. So thanks, Pierce. I just wanted to help you out with those.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, and while Ian's on the phone, this question is for you and Pierce, Ian, is that, with those inclusions and the temper, is there ever a time where you see, I know with like grass and fibers, they're going to burn away, but is there ever a point where some of those inclusions are going to fire away, and that you're not going to be able to see them? Or is that something that is pretty atypical in terms of analysis when you look at the paste, is being able to see what's included?
I'll defer to Ian if he wants to respond first.
With the firing temperatures that we're talking about here, 1250 or less for the most part, the organics will definitely burn away, but other things will not. So you guys saw the thin slices that Pierce was showing you. It was the angular sand particles in the shell. Those things won't burn away at the temperature we're talking about. Some types of firing not involving shell are much higher temperature, and that gets hot enough that the quartz and the sand will actually melt, and then things actually start to change more, to morph into each other, but not so much at these temperatures. But I'll defer the rest of that to yours.
Yeah, sometimes we'll find voids. Like I know in this ceramic slice we have right here, you can see these kind of what would look like been a piece where a shell might have been, but I got the impression these were made from just acidity in the soil. And that's just what the archaeology does over time. But yeah.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions on the chat. Does anyone else have anything to ask Pierce? Okay, well, if something comes up, just type it in the chat. I'm going to see if Ian would like to offer anything else, or if he needs to go ahead and go on. Ian, do you have anything else to add, or?
I'd just like to thank Pierce again and thank all our viewers. It's been a good dialogue, and it's exciting to see folks talking about Choctaw history and culture like this. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed finding those times we were out in the homeland collecting clay.
Well, and thank you again, Pierce, for your presentation. I know that being part of the pottery classes early on, after moving back home to Oklahoma, that was a real joy to be able to spend that time with Ian and Amy and learn from them. And so I know that kind of tender heart moment when you're out on the land and learning from them, they're awesome. So great experience, I'm sure. And so thank you very much for your presentation. I just want to move on a little bit and talk about, one of the great points that Pierce brought up was storytelling. And with archaeology, that's the responsibility that we have, is telling the story from the material culture, from the landscape, from the evidence that's left behind, from people that have lived long ago. So we were really excited to meet Pierce and partner with him on this new project that the Historic Preservation Department is embarking on. We have a 5-year goal, so there's no rush, but we definitely want to put the word out there because this is a community engagement project. We want your stories. This story is called the Choctaw Homestead Project. It's going to be looking at homestead projects from 1830 to 1930 here in Indian Territory. And we, see this in archaeology. Our archaeology program is going out. We're doing surveys for Choctaw programming, before there's a water line put in or a road that's paved, our archaeology program is contacted to go out and make sure that there's no historic sites, there's no burials, and we're really working to protect these cultural resources. In that process and in talking to lots of tribal members, we've realized that the homesteads that were, something that was part that you could see dotted to the landscape are starting to slowly return to that landscape. And we want to be able to capture them and their stories. So we invite all of you tribal members, if you do have a homestead on your property or you had one and you've moved away, or perhaps it was part of your allotment land, we really want to hear from you. We really want to hear your stories. We really want to be able to go out and document them in person. We're going to have a form that's on our Historic Preservation Facebook page. It'll have a little form that you can fill out and submit, with your name, a little bit about what you want to share with us, and, your contact information so that we can arrange a time, hopefully post-COVID, but we may have to do some social distancing in terms of, setting up an appointment to come out and do some measurements, something like that. But we definitely want to after this pandemic is past us, we definitely want to be able to come out and do community events where we're able to share stories in person and really, get to a bigger picture. So backing up a little bit about myself, I am a registered professional archaeologist. I work as the NACRA liaison in historic preservation. My focus in archaeology in my graduate education was on landscape archaeology. Kristen can go into a little bit about hers, but hers was in indigenous archaeology. And so then meeting Pierce was a perfect kind of pairing of all of us. And then, of course, having Dr. Thompson with us as well, putting all of our brains together and really being able to look at the 10.5 counties, our Choctaw Nation boundaries, from both a really wide kind of macro level, and then also, partnering with Pierce to look at it from a very micro level, a site level. And we want to be able to look at all kinds of different information, all kinds of different data, whether the plants that were grown, if there's evidence of land management strategies, down to the structures, the foundations of those buildings, and then what that looks like for the community. We all know, and it's kind of part of the history that we share for our cities and our towns, that it started with maybe a post office, and then that city moved because of the railroad. And so we want to be able to track all of that over time and really put all of this data into a really comprehensive storyline. And so I'll let Pierce and Kristen talk a little bit about some of the things that we're looking for. Kristen can share about going and documenting the first Homestead just a couple weeks ago. And so that was really fun. And then Pierce can go on and talk a little bit about moving forward at OU, kind of springboarding off this research he's done with community engagement and looking towards the future for his graduate education at OU.
Perfect. Thank you, Deanna. Like she mentioned, I'm the tribal archaeologist. My degrees have been focusing on mostly zooarchaeology, so analyzing animal remains to look at past diets. But for my PhD, I kind of shifted gears and did more of a community-based approach, so similar to what Pierce has done. And this Homestead project is going to be really exciting, I think. A few weeks ago, my crew and I went out to Wardville and documented an old Choctaw homestead. Not much left of it, but there are some remnants of the structure, and I took measurements and images, and it's a dog trot cabin and has a few pens behind it, so for hogs or chickens. And it's just really neat to get out there in the 10.5 counties and really see these Choctaw homesteads, because this is where Choctaw families lived. It's where children grew up. It's where people would, have their lives and have their life stories. And it's really important to document those and document it in a non-intrusive way. So we're not excavating, we're not doing anything to the structures, but really just getting out there and hearing people's stories and getting them out to the community. So that's pretty much where we're at now. I've documented one homestead. And if anyone has any, if you have any on your property, or, if your family's homestead, just give us a call or send us an email and we can go out and document it with you and really just get this project going. And it's definitely community based. So any input from the community is treasured and welcome.
Absolutely. I don't know if I'm going now, but yeah, I've been at OU now for 1 year. I'm moving into the rest of my program now. This is the beginning part of my forming dissertation phase, and I was really thankful to be invited to be a part of this project. I'm looking forward to looking at the context of the sites in a very kind of what Deanna said, kind of micro level. And one of the questions I'm going to continue to be thinking about is, how is this connection with the land expressed? And like Kristen said, non-destructive is very important, this preservation. So one thing I'm thinking about looking at is using geophysical studies to non-destructively analyze the layout of these villages, of these homesteads. And I'm really looking forward to that.
That's awesome. So I think it's a great, kind of match and marrying of all kinds of different skill sets within our department to really be able to make like a layered approach to all of this history. And one of the questions that came in is, are we going to be looking at, some of these more prominent names that were part of the Choctaw Nation early on, or, what kind of buildings? And for right now, we want to collect it all. I know it's a big undertaking, but we don't want to be discriminate. We don't want to just focus on the big names, the wealthy that have the big farms. We want to focus on everybody's family history, because that's the only real way that we're going to be able to pinpoint some of those patterns. Maybe there was families that moved into a certain area. Maybe there was traditionalists that stayed in a certain region. Perhaps there was a dominant economic motivation for some of the move and play in the settlement patterns. And so we're not going to be able to see that if we just focus on, say what's in the history books. We really want to engage with you and hear about your family stories, hear about what homesteads that maybe were passed on to you or that you knew about. There's a few towns that people have listed, and we definitely want to know about those that are no longer here, that were thriving at one time. I know that my hometown, where my family's from, it was totally overlooked twice by the railroad, and it just steadily declined. And so, at one time in the early 1900s, it would have been a very booming town, but now it's kind of, you can drive right through it and not really know. So we want to know about it all. Another question came out about general stores and old abandoned stores. Absolutely. Please contact us if you think it's within that window. We would like to know that, because again, we're looking at, economic patterns, settlement patterns, family patterns of when they're coming in. We know that it wasn't just the 1830s removals, that there was removals from Mississippi throughout time. And so we want to be able to document that. Maybe families came in and they ended up with family. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they ended up in another part of the community. And so we really want to be able to tease out some of those things. And as Pierce said, understand the relationship to the land. Was everyone living near the waterways, for instance? Or were people living where there was access to other resources? We just don't know yet. And so we really want to be able to tease that out. So we encourage you to keep in touch. My email is dbird@choctawnation.com. We also have Joe Wolf on board. He is our community outreach specialist. And so you're more than welcome to shoot Joe. I know a lot of you know Joe. Shoot him an email and he can help schedule with us and Kristen about going out and potentially looking at those homesteads or those general stores. But yes, we definitely want to get you guys involved. So please reach out to us. And there's no history that's too small, and no history that's too insignificant. So we really want to be able to do that. Another question that came in. And again, so this was talking a little bit about different groups within the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. And right now we want to know it all. And so, as I said, we're not discriminate in terms of, prominent figures or, that little family that maybe was only here for a little while and then decided to migrate out west or back east. We want to know who was here, and those families and those homesteads, general stores. We want to be able to put that on the map. And use some geospatial techniques to be able to create a really wonderful story map for our communities. So please send it all in. We're interested in all of it. All right, well, I don't have any more questions. It doesn't look like there's any more coming in. I don't have too much more information. Kristen, Pierce, do you have anything else to say or to see? Anything else to add?
I don't have anything personally, but Angela brought up a really good point. There's a growing community of researchers and scholars who are also collecting stories from the territory. Where can they be shared? And that's a great point. If we have other people who are doing projects similar, or even if they're not exactly similar, we should probably, create something where we can all kind of share these thoughts and these ideas, because I think it's important to look at it as one whole territory, not just Choctaw land, Cherokee, and Osage. So yeah, I think that's an excellent point.
Hey, there's Megan. She's back.
Okay, Megan.
Okay, Megan, do you have any other questions or anything to add about the upcoming project?
I totally missed that part. It was like the part that got cut out when I had to go. So unfortunately, I'll have to watch this again later. Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you again, Pierce, for joining us today. And I look forward to working with you virtually and someday in person. We're really happy to have you on board. And I know that you have a big heart for Choctaw history. And so we're really pleased to be able to partner with you.
Thank you all for inviting me to be part of the project and also to be a speaker at the series. I'm sure I'll be interacting with you virtually more over the next little while. And for those of you in the Ms. Lily's 10 a.m. class, I'll see you on Monday at 10 a.m. virtually.
All right.
I'll just throw this out there. But, our next class officially is going to be with Dr. Greg O'Brien. He is an associate professor at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro, and he has a book called Choctaws in the Revolutionary Age, 2 edited expressions about pre-revolutionary Choctaw history, Choctaws in the South. So join us on October 6th at 11 a.m. We will send out emails and let you know, but that'll be our next official.
All right. Well, Chippy Chicky.